Kaitlyn and Abby make a delivery. The trains on the island of Sodor and North America are proud of being really useful and healthy and strong. They pull passenger cars and freight cars of where they need to go. Women trains are also really useful. They pull freight cars and coaches more easily because they're really pretty. Kaitlyn is a woman train, and she is a mixed traffic engine. She can pull freight cars and coaches because she is really useful. And the freight cars were rolling along behind her one day as she brought them all the way to Vickerstown. One day, Sir Topham Hatt came to see Kaitlyn and her sister Abby. He had an important job. "Today, you two," Sir Topham Hatt said, "I'd like both of you to take a train to Vickerstown." Thomas was concerned. "I'm afraid my driver had tested positive for COVID," Thomas said nervously. "So I have a female driver instead." "That's so cool," both of the sisters said. Kaitlyn and Abby soon arrived in the rail yard, and they buffered up to their train. And they steamed off towards Vickerstown. "Here we go," Kaitlyn said. "Freight train coming through." "Of course it's a freight train," Abby said. "We should go through soon, Kaitlyn." The freight cars rolled along down the northeast corridor that went from Boston to Washington, D.C. The freight cars were full of lots of natural stuff. The two women engines came through a tunnel, and the freight cars clattered along, and it echoed everywhere. Clickety-clack, here we go," laughed the trucks. The freight cars were full of everything, like books, toys, newspapers, and more. Kaitlyn blew her whistle, and they steamed through the mountains. The freight cars were full of 63 freight cars, and Kaitlyn and Abby used their locomotives to pull forward. Kaitlyn's locomotive pulled the train along with Abby trailing. "Choo-choo, here we go," she said, and the freight cars carried on. And some farmers in their field watched the train go by too. It was big. The mega goods train had 63 freight cars of lots of items. And the brake van was in the rear. Kaitlyn and Abby steamed onto the main line that carried on past big cities. And Kaitlyn used her locomotive to use lots of horsepower in the wagons. Further up down the line, Mercedes and Mimi were waiting. "We have to get going after the train passes," Mimi said. Meanwhile, Sally was taking pipes to the maintenance facility at Silica Siding, where the Casey, South Carolina train collision happened. "I must get there on time," she said. Abby and Kaitlyn were pulling There's a car on the line ahead, Kaitlyn said. Watch out, Abby! Kaitlyn's driver suddenly noticed this unexpectedly, and he threw his locomotive into emergency braking. And Kaitlyn's wheels skidded along the line, knowing to avoid a crash, but there was no way to do it. "Oh no!" cried Kaitlyn as she flipped over with all the freight cars, and she bumped into Mercedes, and everything exploded! Luckily, no one was hurt, but the freight cars that weren't derailed stayed on the line, and 22 came off the line, covering all the engines and lots of messy stuff. Kaitlyn had flipped onto her side and was covered in fruit. "I'm stuck," she said. "This stuff is all messy," Mercedes said. "I don't like being in this either," Sally said. "I'm still upright," Abby said. When Edward saw the accident, he was surprised. Kaitlyn had turned onto her side, but Abby was still upright. "That looks like a gross crash," Edward said. "It'll be cleaned up in no time." That night, Kaitlyn and Abby stayed in the sheds, getting repaired, and it was taking a long time. When morning broke, Kaitlyn and Abby were ready for work. "Let's go collect the passenger train," said Abby. "Yes, Abby, we should," said Kaitlyn. And the two engines left the maintenance facility on their way to work, and they hoped nothing would obstruct their track ever again. That's it.